So I would like to say good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen from Stockholm, and good morning for you who participate from the other parts of the world. As chair for the UNECE Working Party for Regulatory Cooperation and Standardization Policies, I'm extremely happy on behalf of UNECE and the Working Party 6 to open this side event focusing on how standards can contribute to achieve sustainable development goals. I would also like to express my appreciation to the involvement of the International Organization for Standardization and the Permanent Mission of Germany, who are co-hosting this event with UNECE. Working with international regulatory cooperation for more than 25 years, I can honestly say that a lot have been done to and made to explain and raise awareness about the role standards have in our society. More and more people understand that standards can solve effectively common problems, that international standards are better for market access than national or regional ones, which risk, of course, trade barriers, but also that not only dull and boring people work with these technical standards. On a more serious note, I also know that much more needs to be done, especially to show how standards are an effective tool to promote policy goals such as sustainability, gender representation, and inclusiveness. But this requires, however, international cooperation, implementation tools, and still much more efforts on standards in education. This afternoon and evening, or for you, some of you maybe morning, will be devoted on these topics. And I'm very pleased, therefore, that we have been able to engage 6 top professionals for this side event that can share their knowledge and competence with us. For your information, this event will be recorded, and the UNECE Secretariat plans to disseminate it after the event on the UNECE YouTube channel. As we have quite limited time today, I suggest that we take all the questions in the very end of the session. But let's start with today's keynote speaker, Mrs. Elisa Almeida. Mrs. Almeida is counselor at the Mexican mission to the WTO, where she is in charge of negotiations for agriculture, non-agricultural market access, accessions, and technical barriers to trade. She is also currently the chairperson of the TBT committee. Mrs. Almeida has been part of the Mexican Ministry of Economy for over 15 years, focusing her experience in multilateral and bilateral trade negotiations. She has also held the positions as the private sector and development project related to the promotion of good regulatory practices. Mrs. Almeida holds a Master in Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and have a BA in International Trade from the Tech de Monastrey. I'm very happy to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning to all. First, I would like to thank the UNECE Working Party 6 on Regulatory Cooperation and Standardization for this kind invitation to the Regional Forum side event on standards and the role as catalyst to achieving the SDGs. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to the debates and bring the perspective from the work being done by members in the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee in WTO. As a disclaimer, I should say that opinions are my own and only reflect my experience of the years working as a delegate in the committee and more recently as its chairperson. It does not represent a WTO or country position. Going now more into details, since the main theme of the presentations that will follow have a common thread of showcasing the importance of cooperation, implementation of standards, and information dissemination, I will try to channel this spirit and convey the importance from a general TBT committee lens. So I will focus on 3 broad ideas, which are the importance of international standards in the TBT agreement, the importance of the 6 principles and international cooperation, and the importance of sharing knowledge and practices in the TBT committee, particularly in a changing environment like the one we have experienced with COVID-19. As the brochure of this event rightly pointed out, standards are all around us. Most goods and many services are affected in a way or another by standards, which is why ensuring that standards become a catalyst for economic development and not an obstacle to growth or trade is of critical importance. For that, the importance of international standards, I might be stating the obvious to participants of the working group that focuses on regulatory cooperation and standardization policies when I say that international standards are of interest because they are an effective tool for international cooperation to enhance regulatory alignment across countries and reduce unnecessary trade costs. But I believe it's worthwhile repeating this message, given that international standards can sometimes be an aid and other times a hinder for trade to flow. And as you may know, the aim of the TBT agreement is to ensure that regulations, standards, testing, and certification procedures followed by WTO members do not create unnecessary obstacles to trade. International standards are at the core of the WTO TBT agreement. Its provisions require the use of relevant international standards as a basis for national regulations, except if the regulation will be ineffective or inappropriate to accomplish the member's legitimate objective. It incentivizes members to fully harmonize measures with international standards and strongly encourages members to participate in development of international standards. International standards provide support to policymaking, but do not provide a substitute for government authority. As a quick refresher, under the agreement, members have the right to prepare, adopt, and apply regulations necessary to achieve public policy objectives, such as protection of human health and safety, animal life and health, environmental protection, or consumer information, at levels of protection they consider appropriate. The disciplines set in the TBT agreement promote good regulatory practices and international regulatory cooperation. Although governments are obliged to use relevant international standards as the basis of regulation, the agreement also allows a degree of flexibility with respect to the choice of standard and the manner of its use. This flexibility is particularly important since there are legitimate reasons why members may regulate differently, including varying perceptions of risk, income levels, culture, or political and legal systems, or practical differences in national situations and capacity. In the WTO context, international standards provide a benchmark towards avoiding unnecessary barriers to trade. Article 2.5 of the agreement lends it the presumption of conformity to government measures that are in accordance with international standards. In other words, WTO members have a strong incentive to use international standards, since harmonizing their measures with relevant standards would provide a safe haven for challenge. In a way, the TBT committee members have recognized that the international standards can aid in the achievement of the SDGs, and I quote, "International standards should be an opportunity, a pool for technological know-how, and an important link between research, innovation, and markets that can contribute positively to economic growth. As such, standards can contribute to promoting technical progress and are an important instrument to facilitate competition in markets and transfer technology between members." End of quote. So international standards can help promote greater regulatory alignment on global scale, which can play a part in supporting SDGs achievement, such as those related to good health and well-being, clear water sanitation, and affordable clean energy. Now, passing to the second issue I wanted you to have as the main key points from this intervention is that international cooperation and the importance of the 6 principles. TBT committee plays a key role as a forum for cooperation that is frequently cited by other WTO members as an example of where things work well and as a potential role model for other WTO bodies. I believe this is true mainly because we are able to walk the talk. That is through our reviews and decisions, we have established guidance that allow us to better implement our agreement and foster cooperation. We have been able to discuss and agree on issues that have become critical to our work and the work of other organizations as UNECE. And believe me, it's not always an easy feat in WTO. Some of these decisions have found their way into regional trade agreements as TBT plus elements and good regulatory practices. In its triennial reviews, the committee has recognized the need for international standards to be relevant and effectively respond to regulatory and market needs. as well as scientific and technological developments, while not creating unnecessary obstacles to international trade. So now I would like to underscore the importance of one decision that is perhaps the most significant decision in the TBT committee that it has ever adopted. So this is the famous 6-principle decision on international standardization. That even after 20 years of its adoption, the guidance on transparency, openness, impartiality and consensus, effectiveness and relevance, coherence and the development dimension remains at the core of our work and continues to be relevant. This is the case, for instance, in a recent information briefing of the WTO on trade and climate change, really drives the point that given the variety of policies and approaches countries may take in mitigation policies, international standards for measuring carbon emissions will play an important role in avoiding obstacles to trade and underscores the need to follow the 6 principles in the development of the relevant standards. It particularly calls on standards to be agreed ideally by consensus to ensure relevant information is available, that written comments are allowed, that conflicts of international standards are not adopted, and to ensure also that the constraints of developing countries are considered. However, we also need to consider that the implementation of the 6 principles is not without challenges. In a recent event that highlighted the importance of these 6 principles, participants were asked, what are the main challenges to implement them? And I'm sure your organization might know even more on this. But concisely, it's which ones are more problematic. It will not come as a surprise that the main challenge had to do with priorities, resources, and different understandings of the terms in the different regions. This, to me, underscores the value of cooperation, the value of promoting a closer dialogue among all stakeholders to ensure that we find ways of converging. That brings me to another challenge that was mentioned regarding openness, which is how to ensure that there is an active stakeholder process that is able to include all the dimensions from consumer, SMEs, standard setting bodies, regulators, etc. And how to ensure that standards are relevant for different actors that need to play with the same rules. In my opinion, it's clear that the manner in which international standards are set have a decisive impact on the way that and extent they can be used as a basis. In other words, the relevance of a standard is not only about the issue it's dealing with, but also the process in which the standard was created, and following the guidance on how best to develop standards that are relevant, respond to the needs and developments, will contribute to the aim of avoiding unnecessary obstacles and facilitate global trade. Now, coming to the importance of sharing knowledge and cooperation practices of the TBT committee. Over the years, and particularly in the triennial reviews, the committee has continued its focus on standards by first encouraging members and observers organizations and relevant bodies involved in development of standards to exchange experiences on impacts of standards and on economic impacts of standards, on economic development and international trade. We have stressed the importance of ensuring the effective application of a code of good practice for the preparation, adoption, and application of standards, so the Annex 3 of the TBT agreement. And encouraging also the full application of the 6 principles set out in this decision and the sharing of experience in respect of their use. Another way that we have found to be a way of having a conversation about standards is by bringing or discussing and sometimes even resolving concerns with respect to other members' draft or adopted standards and regulations. Members take very seriously this practice of raising specific trade concerns, since it is a practice that offers them and their stakeholders a faster, cheaper, non-litigious alternative avenue for addressing trade frictions that in some cases arise from the non-adherence to relevant standards. Thematic sessions have become an integral part of our experience sharing activities. Not only are they an important vehicle for knowledge dissemination, they have become key in fostering cooperation among members in a range of issues and a way to start a conversation on areas that might require further guidance. Most of the committee's recent exchanges of experiences on standards took place in the context of a thematic session held on 12th of November 2019 and a workshop on the role of gender in the development of standards health on the 8th of December 2020, which UNECE was part of. In this workshop, members discussed perspectives, experiences, and best practices on including gender considerations in standards development. Members also share real-world experiences of how gender considerations have been taken into account in standards development. Mathematic sessions have showcased the experience among members on how they take part in standard setting discussions, good practices that could lead to a greater involvement in developing countries in these activities, as well as how members incorporate international standards in their regulatory processes, including with respect to conformity assessment. Events like this are a valuable asset to start conversations in up and coming issues, such as climate change, digitalization, plastic pollution, and the role of gender in standard setting. As we look into the future, we also need to acknowledge the recent lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic and how we can help to be prepared for other crises. COVID-19 underlined the vital role of standards and regulations for timely access to medical goods. During the pandemic, there was unprecedented surges in demand for personal protective equipment, pharmaceutical, vaccines, medical devices, and equipment. These developments forced governments and industry to boost production and find new suppliers to address the health crisis. So that medical goods could reach their population as quickly as possible, members took various trade facilitating measures with respect to TBT and regulation, such as streamlining or simplifying certification and related procedures. A number of these were notified to WTO since the start of the pandemic. Around 200 new or changed TBT regulations were notified in response to COVID-19, representing around 40% of all WTO notifications of COVID-19. But despite these efforts to accelerate processes, manufacturers encounter various regulatory bottlenecks to scale up and distribution of vaccines and other medical goods. These include divergent requirements on applications for authorization, the need for customized dossier, retesting of vaccines for quality control in countries of importation prior to release, lack of facilitated processes for managing post-approval changes, delays in receiving WHO emergency use listing for certain vaccine or supply chains, and challenges in moving from emergency use authorization to regular approval and registration of vaccine. Duplication of rigorous local testing created delays and uncertainty for suppliers of diagnostics and other medical devices. TBT agreement and the work of its committee can assist WTO members in overcoming regulatory bottlenecks and ensuring efficient and prompt response to international health emergency through regulatory cooperation. In particular, TBT agreement strongly encourages the use of international standards as a basis of technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment, as well as recognition of conformity assessment results. These tools could be helpful in facilitating international trade in essential medical products by streamlining regulatory approval, including in the context of a public health emergency. The TBT committee could also be used as a platform for exchanging best practices and challenges in addressing such regulatory bottlenecks. And members have had robust exchanges in their experiences in the committee, most recently in March 2021, on the topic of accreditation. And we will continue to compile a list of best practices of future pandemic preparedness in regulatory area, based on lessons from the past few years. So as a conclusion, I would like to leave you with the following thoughts. It is evident that standards are needed to build public trust and confidence in products and services that we trade among each other. If we really want standards to have a real chance of being a catalyst in helping achieving the SDGs, it's of vital importance that these standards reflect the 6 principles that are enshrined in the decision and are developed in a way that fosters cooperation. Meeting different standards and regulations is one of the main constraints for businesses trying to access new markets. And an increasing globalized world that will have to adapt to new challenges, such as those arising from climate change, food and health crisis, ensuring that international standards remain relevant and are not part of bottlenecks that affect businesses and trade will be critical. And organizations like UNECE have a role to play. Lastly, from a trade perspective, it is clear that without international standards, there will be less international trade, fewer markets for exporters, and less variety for consumers. The challenge is then how to ensure we achieve the right balance of providing certainty and ensuring we're not unnecessarily impeding trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Almeida, highlighting the role, WTO perspective on international standards, and also sharing information about the TBT committee work. I think also that you highlight especially the 6 principles in the TBT agreement is a very good baseline for all the discussions on how to work with standards. So it's an excellent introduction to today's theme. So thank you so much for your contribution. And I hope as many other speakers can stay with us for the question and answer session in the end of the seminar. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is from the International Organization for Standardization, Mrs. Noelia Garcia Nebra. She is the head of sustainability in charge of advancing ISO's commitment to the UN SDGs. Previously, Mrs. Garcia worked in ISO capacity building unit, focusing primarily on issues related to standards and regulations and good standardization practices, and supporting the Secretariat of DEVCO, the Committee on Developing Country Matters. As ISO standards and gender and focal point, she coordinates the implementation of the ISO Gender Action Plan and advises ISO SG on gender-related issues. Mrs. Garcia has 15 years of professional experience in international organizations delivering technical cooperation projects in developing countries in areas of trade, investment, and SME development. Today, you will talk about the importance of cooperation to achieve internationally agreed standards to support SDGs. It's great to have you with us, and I look forward for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and thank you, Ms. Almeida, for this very nice introduction to our topic today. Let me share my screen. As mentioned by Heidi, I'm going to talk about the importance of collaboration in the context of international standardization. So, just a little bit of context. I mean, I know all of us, we are aware of the current situation and how we are advancing in achieving the UN SDGs, but I wanted to share with you the results presented in the last reports on how we are doing achieving those goals set in 2015. And as you can see on the screen, there is quite some work to be done, and no country, no single person can do that alone. I mean, collaboration is key to respond, to recover for the global shocks we are experiencing, and more than ever, I think the multilateral system must be supported effectively through collaboration. That's where international standards can play a key role. We standardizers, we want to be at the forefront of this response in contributing at achieving those goals. The role of international standards has been highlighted by Ms. Almeida, but also by other members of the international committee, such as the UN Secretary General or the EU Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmström, among others. And indeed, cooperation is at the heart of the ISO system. Let me tell you a little bit what is ISO and how we develop standards, and you will see that cooperation is really key to develop solutions to global challenges through standardization. So we are a network of 167 member countries. We have more than 40,000 experts around the world from all sorts of stakeholder categories. We have the private sector, regulators, consumers, SMEs, academia, civil society, international organizations. They can participate in ISO's work through the liaison link. We have more than 700 international partners, among them the WTO, the ITC, the UNECE, where we are an observer, and we really welcome our collaboration with Working Party 6, OECD, among others. And of course, the key partnership we have with IEC and ITU as our sister organizations in standards development. We have today in our portfolio more than 24,000 standards. The Central Secretariat is in Geneva, but otherwise the network is all around the world through our members and their experts. And today we have more than 300 technical committees developing more than 100 standards every month. So already by this description, you can imagine the scope of the network and how much collaborating is important. So what's the context? In last year, ISO, in 2020, ISO developed the Vision 2030. We recognize that we operate in a world where change is constant and where challenges and disruptions can be global in scale. And that's why our vision for 2030 is aligned with the United Nations goals, the SDGs, the Global Agenda for 2030. Our vision is making lives easier, safer, and better. And as you see, that's pretty much aligned with the UN 2030 agenda of achieving a better and more sustainable future for all. How we want to achieve this vision through three main goals. The first one is developing standards that are used everywhere. The second one is meeting global needs. We want to respond to global challenges. We want to meet global needs. And the third one, which again highlights the importance of collaborations, is all voices heard. We want to have all the voices at the table. We want to hear from them because that's the only way we can meet global needs, and that's the only way we can have ISO standards used everywhere. And that's our mission. We want, through our members and our stakeholders, and that's also very important for us, again, like this importance of the network of we cannot do this alone. It's through our members and their stakeholders. We bring people together to agree on international standards that respond to global challenges. ISO standards support global trade. They drive inclusive and equitable economic growth. They advance innovation and promote health and safety to achieve a sustainable future. So through our mission, again, I think the sense of collaboration is pretty much put forward. We heard from Ms. Almeida about the principles of the WTO. ISO standards develop standards, ISO develops standards following those principles. Those 6 principles, they are very important for us of transparency, coherence, effectiveness and relevance, openness, impartiality and consensus, and development dimension. And in addition to that, ISO makes a lot of emphasis on 3 other principles, which is the due process. We really put a lot of attention on the process of developing the standards. The national implementation and adoption of ISO standards, that's our goal, that standards are used at the national level. And the third one, which again is key in making sure that our standards meet global needs, is stakeholder engagement. That's a lot of effort that we put in that specific action, engaging stakeholders through our members. We have thousands of standards that support sustainability. I know sometimes ISO is just recognized by quality standards, but we have, as I said, more than 24 standards that cover pretty much all possible aspects, except those, of course, covered by ITU and IEC, although we also have collaborations in developing standards jointly. These standards, they represent globally recognized guidelines based on international collaboration. They address economic, environmental, and social dimensions and are effective tools to support governments, industry, and consumers contribute to the achievement of the SDGs. ISO standards help organizations all over the world integrate sustainability into their operations and participate in international trade. Regulators also can refer to international standards, either in traditional regulations, ensuring that they do not create uneven playing fields, as was highlighted by Ms. Almeida, but standards can also be used in in either a more agile or different ways of regulatory of regulations, for example, in co-regulation or in the aspects of self-regulation. So they are definitely tools supporting the achievement of the UN SDGs. So as I mentioned, at ISO, collaboration is the backbone of everything we do. Is it through collaboration with our members and them collaborating with all areas of society that we create standards that create value and contribute to global challenges. We collaborate with our members through the Secretariat here in Geneva, and we provide support for members to participate in international standardization.
Mrs. Garcia, you need to go a little bit faster due to the
yes,
time constraints.
I'm almost done. Developing countries are also very important for us. There are 75% of our members, and we have capacity building support and a committee, as you mentioned, looking at matters for developing countries. We welcome participation from everyone. That's a way for organizations to raise their voice, to shape best practices in developing standards. Standardization, it supports knowledge transfer by participating in standardization. You learn from the other experts, but you also transfer your knowledge to other experts, and of course you help keeping market access open. Just very fast, two initiatives linked to SDGs that I would like to mention. The London Declaration is the ISO's commitment to supporting the climate agenda. It was launched in September and approved by all ISO members at the General Assembly. We want to make sure that our standards consider climate science, and we want to make sure that everyone is at the table. The civil society and the most vulnerable are at the table developing standards for climate change. And then we heard also about gender. ISO signed the UNECE Declaration on Gender Responsive Standards, and following that and following our commitment, we have developed an agenda action plan. The first one finished last year, and we have just launched the new Gender Action Plan 2022-2025 to make sure that we have more women at the table and to make sure that we develop gender responsive standards. And we have also other initiatives that you can see on screen, and I believe the presentation will be shared later, so I will not get into details. And with that, I will finish my presentation, and I will be available for further questions, if any. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Garcia Nebra. It's very interesting to see the whole width of standards. As you said, you could think that it's only about quality standards, but also showing the width of environmental and sustainability standards. And also very interesting to hear about the new action plans and initiatives. There's some of also new information for me. So thank you so much for your contribution. Extremely valuable. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move forward in our exciting program. I'm very happy to announce that our next speaker is Mrs. Rosie Saville. Ms. Saville occupies the post of First Secretary Economic at the UK Mission to the UN, an international organization in Geneva, focusing on standards and regulatory issues, particularly in relation to trade, digital and tech, and environment. She is also head of the UK delegation to the UNECE. Mrs. Saville has a background in trade and regulatory policy and previously advised the UK government on aid programs supporting the development of quality infrastructure and standards capacity in developing countries. I'm very happy to have you with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and great to be part of such a brilliant panel. I'm very lucky. I'm also going to talk about standards and cooperation but from more of a Working Party 6 perspective. So hopefully very complementary to Noelia's excellent presentation. I'll cover two aspects. First of all, the potential that standards have as a tool for cooperation internationally. And secondly, how we make sure standards themselves are developed in partnerships. And one of the great advantages of Working Party 6 work is that it deals with both of these dimensions. So how can standards be helpful to us as a tool for cooperation on cross-border challenges? I mean, first of all, trade is really at the heart of what Working Party 6 does. And as we've heard from both of our speakers so far, standards are really fundamental for trade. Increasing these standards and technical regulations determine the ability of businesses to move goods and services across borders. In most sectors, the restrictiveness of non-tariff measures far exceeds tariffs, and removing those barriers creates new opportunities for economic growth and prosperity. So Elisa explained how the WTO's agreement on technical barriers to trade aims to tackle this by encouraging members to base their technical regulations on internationally agreed standards, and the benefits of doing that for boosting trade in terms of ease of entering new markets, reducing the cost of trade, and achieving economies of scale. And standards can also help guarantee trust along supply chains, which is all the more important as we strive for greater sustainability and better labour conditions along these supply chains. So much of Working Party 6's work really tries to give life to that commitment to base technical regulations on international standards. For example, it's promoting the convergence of technical regulations that guarantee people's safety in industrial processes which use explosive materials, for earth-moving machinery, and cross-border fuel pipelines using ISO, IEC, and other standards as a basis for that work. But then market surveillance has become increasingly important during the pandemic, as countries have needed to get products like PPE into markets quickly, whilst managing any risks to human health, environmental protection, and fair competition. Working Party 6's advisory group on market surveillance provides a platform to share tools which help implement risk-based approaches, including conformity assessment, interagency coordination, and public awareness raising. And then at the end of last year, UNECE members approved Recommendation V on addressing product non-compliance risk in international trade. And that supports countries to smooth the passage of goods across borders by adopting integrated risk management strategies that bring together the requirements of different regulatory agencies. But standards are not just useful for growing trade, as we've already heard. They also have huge potential to underpin cooperation on other transboundary challenges. As Noelia said in her presentation, all of the SDGs require international collaboration, and we're behind. The UNECE's latest report shows that the region is on track only to meet a quarter of its SDG targets by 2030, which is quite a depressing outlook. So take climate change, for example. Governments sent really strong signals at COP26 in Glasgow about the need for a transition to net zero carbon emissions. And as part of the next stage of delivering that, there's now a huge need for consistent internationally recognised standards and targets in areas such as industrial decarbonisation and critical minerals management. And we also need the trade, intellectual property and standard systems to work in harmony to get green technologies to where they're needed quickly. It's really encouraging to see the partnerships that are starting to develop in different parts of the standards ecosystem to drive progress on sustainability. And ISO and UNECE's collaboration on mapping standards for the SDGs is a really good example of that. Just a few weeks ago, for example, we saw that the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation and the Global Reporting Initiative have announced a collaboration agreement between their respective standard setting boards, which will help to align sustainability reporting initiatives and make things hopefully easier and clearer for companies, investors and citizens. As part of UNECE's focus on circular economy and sustainable resource management, Working Party 6 has been looking at the role that standards can play in driving more circular economic models where materials stay in use for longer. It's clear that standards and regulation are a really important part of the answer on that. They can underpin a common understanding of what circularity means, provide shared reference points on which you can build with innovation, and allow those innovations to be scaled more quickly. Standards can also help ensure that product design factors in reuse and recycling from the very beginning, and offer consumers guarantees of the quality and sustainability of the products that they buy. So those are all standards and regulatory problems, and it's a particularly hot topic this week as the European Commission recently published its circular economy package. So all in all, standards are a great tool for international cooperation, but they also need to be developed cooperatively, as we've already heard. The first point I'd make here, and I'm really grateful to Elisa for taking us back to first principles or the first 6 principles. It's really important to be inclusive. A standard is only as good as the collective inputs of those who contribute to it. So the broader the collaboration, the better the result you get. And if you want to achieve global impact on some of these problems, then that collaboration needs to include developed and developing countries. And that is one of the reasons that the UK funded a few years ago the launch of the Commonwealth Standards Network programme a few years ago, which is run by the British Standards Institution. And it supports national standards bodies in developing countries to develop their standards strategies and engage in the development of standards organisations like ISO. We know that the international standards ecosystem needs to serve all in order to work effectively. It's also why diversity in standards is so important, and we'll hear more on the gender responsive standards initiative later, I think. We need to ensure that we capitalise on the expertise and experience of all types of people in developing standards. And we need standards that benefit all end users, regardless of gender, disability, race, and other characteristics. And education, I think, is an important part of drawing those communities in as well. The UK's Office of Product Safety and Standards has recently sponsored our national standards body, the British Standards Institution, to develop a flex standard, which is a sort of standard developed using an agile iterative process, which aims to improve the inclusiveness of data used in standards making. And this standard will help ensure that standards themselves become more inclusive and that they better cater to a wider range of human differences and meet the needs of all their users and those who are affected by their use. So cooperation on standards needs to be inclusive, diverse, and finally, it needs to be based on multi-stakeholder cooperation, just like Agenda 2030. In order to succeed on Agenda 2030, we need to work in partnership between governments, businesses, civil society, and consumers. Standards development bodies have unrivaled experience in bringing these groups together and somehow getting to consensus. They've been grappling with the challenges of a sort of interconnected and interdisciplinary world for some time. So I think there's a lot that governments and I'm sure other stakeholders too can learn from that process. So to sum up, I think Working Party 6 can really add value as a platform to ensure that standards bodies, regulatory authorities, governments and international organisations break down silos and keep cooperating to ensure that the way we use standards and regulations sets us on a path to achieving the SDGs as quickly as possible. At the end of the day, standards are a tool to help us solve problems. So the more effectively you use them and the more inclusively you develop them, the better your chances are of solving that problem. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Seville, for a very informative presentation, also highlighting of the current work that is going on, which is very, very good for all of us to know. Thank you so much for your contribution. We have now heard about the importance of international collaboration, but how about gender responsive standards? How can these really be promoted in practice and implemented? Our next speaker, Ms. Dorothy Ulrike Schwill, will highlight this issue. Since July 2021, Ms. Dorothy Schwill has been serving as Counselor for the Development Policy at the Permanent Mission of the Federal Republic of Germany to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. In this role, she oversees Germany's engagements with Geneva-based global partnerships and international organizations active in the area of development cooperation, with a special focus on aid for trade. As trained economist and alumnus of the German Development Institute, Mrs. Dorothy Schwill joined the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in 2007. Previous assignments as the BMZ include the role of Senior Policy Advisor for the German Bilateral Development Cooperation with Mongolia, working with water and climate issues, as well as on the principles of good financial governance. We'll really look forward to your contribution and messages on this topic. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, good morning and good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this side event and also to highlight some thoughts on the importance of gender responsive standards. Next slide, please. Thanks. The new Minister of the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, Ms. Svenja Schulze, has a goal to shape development policy in a feminist way. This aligns with a decision of Germany's first female foreign minister, Ms. Annalena Baerbock, who declared she would follow Sweden, Canada, Mexico, and others in pursuing a feminist foreign policy. It is time to consider gender equality as an overarching guiding principle and not only a thematic issue. The aim of a feminist development policy is the realization of human rights and the equal social, political, and economic participation of all people, regardless of their gender identity, their ethnicity, their migration status, their age, a possible disability, or other identity characteristics. Even in 2022, this goal will not be achieved in any country in the world. To achieve gender equality, we do need staying power. Next slide, please. Moving from the policy level to Germany's cooperation with developing countries, I would like to focus on gender responsive standards and how they contribute to feminist development policy. A standard describes the best way of doing something. We all need standards in our everyday lives. This has been mentioned in the great contributions before. But when standards are not gender responsive and do not consider specific needs of women, they can be detrimental for the health and safety of women. Standards are also indispensable for the global economy. Standards facilitate trade by removing trade barriers and are key to improving security or environmental protection. Standards are an element of quality infrastructure, a system that also includes metrology, conformity assessment, and accreditation. All these elements interact with each other. It is the task of the Physikalisch-Technische Bundesanstalt, the PTB, which is an implementing agency of the German government, to support countries worldwide in the development of these elements and ultimately ensure that quality infrastructure enables sustainable development. PTB works in collaboration with many national organizations in developing countries, but also with international organizations such as UNECE and ISO, also UNIDO. In addition to their technical expertise, these international organizations have a large network and the means for international agenda setting, for example, through events like this one today. Next slide, please. The UNECE Working Party on Regulatory Cooperation and Standardization policies and Germany have a long story of cooperation. Germany also had the honor to hold the position of Working Party chair, and it was during this time that the Working Party became increasingly concerned with the gender responsive standards. Germany appreciates the valuable work of the Gender Responsive Standards Initiative. It aims at providing a practical way forward for standards bodies to make the standards they develop and the process for standards development more gender responsive. It is obvious that standards must reflect the needs of 100% of the population, not just 50%, if they're to fulfill their goal to ensure the safety, quality, and reliability of products and services and facilitate trade, protect our health and the health of the environment. We consider the development and promotion of gender responsive standards a very practical example, albeit perhaps lesser known, of how steps are being taken towards achieving SDG 5 on gender equality. Therefore, since 2018, Germany has been funding the UNECE project enhancing usage and uptake of standards for sustainable development, gender equality, and the empowerment of women and girls. Through training and mapping activities as supported by an online portal, this project aims to increase transparency, understanding, and access to standards and to support greater harmonization of standards across sustainability activity. An online portal, we can share the link also in the chat, will host existing e-learning training programs and support the dissemination of research and training on the role of standards in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Also through this project, important activities have been implemented by the team of Working Party 6 that contribute to achieving SDG 5 and lead to more gender justice and standards development. This is good practices, and the uptake of gender responsive standards have been showcased, and awareness raising and information events were organized on different continents. Even during the pandemic, the work continued online and e-learning training materials on gender responsive standards were developed. At the end of the project in June, a final high-level meeting is planned to further raise awareness for this issue. Next slide, please. It is essential that this work has an impact beyond the geographical UNECE region, and it does, as the Gender Responsive Standards Declaration impressively underlines. Since its launch in 2019, more than 75 national standard-setting institutions from all over the world have signed the declaration. Among them, institutions from Togo, Botswana, and Mexico. Gender responsiveness is, of course, not only a topic for developing countries. Both German standard-setting organizations, the German Institute for Standardization, and the Association for Electrical, Electronic, and Information Technologies also signed the declaration and made a public commitment to ensure that the content and impact of their standards, when implemented, are gender responsive. But to make a real impact, it is particularly important to also engage international organizations in the work on gender responsive standards. We are therefore pleased that many of them have signed the declaration. For example, Fair Trade International, the African Organization for Standardization, and of course, the International Organization for Standardization, just to mention a few. With such a broad alliance, we are hopeful that more and more standards will reflect an understanding of physical differences and gender roles, while equally addressing the needs of women and men. Although more gender-responsive standards are merely one of many elements to realize the feminist development policy and to achieve the goal of SDG 5, they are important. As many standards are not yet gender responsive, there's still much work to be done. Likewise, it is important to continue promoting the Gender Responsive Standards Declaration, and even more importantly, to see it implemented. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Ulrika Schwill, for demonstrating the German engagement in the Gender Responsive Standards Initiative, and also telling about the challenges ahead and the importance of the continued work. Thank you so much for your contribution. Our next prestigious speaker is also an expert on gender responsive standards. I hope we have with us Michelle Parkuda. Mrs. Parkuda is the Manager Research at the Standards Council of Canada. She is responsible for leading research to demonstrate the economic and social value of standardization. Michelle co-leads the gender strategy at the Standards Council of Canada, is leading the project team 2 on gender responsive standards methodology for Gender Responsive Standards Initiative within the UNECE Working Party 6. In addition, she was appointed to the newly formed Diversity Advisory Committee at IEC. She also authored the report When One Size Does Not Protect All, Understanding Why Gender Matters for Standardization. Michelle has a PhD in experimental psychology from McGill University. We are very happy to hear your contribution. Mrs. Parkuda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today to share with you some of the work that we've been doing at the Standards Council and also at the UNECE. I think one of the things that the work that Working Party 6 has done that's been so important and so instrumental in raising awareness around gender responsiveness and the need to address the gender gap in standards and standards development. I think this sentence summarizes it really well. It says, the Declaration acknowledges that representation of women in standard development is almost always below parity, and that the outcomes for men and women are not explicitly addressed during the standards development process. There's two things I think that we need to really emphasize there. The first is to talk about the representation of women. And we know that while the data is scarce, the data we have shows that women are underrepresented. In Canada, when we have experts developing standards, international standards for ISO and IEC, about 20% of them, or just over 20% of them, are women. Those experts are drawn from our labor force. And if we look at the labor force in Canada, the labor force is almost at parity, with 48% of the labor force being women. And so clearly women are not engaging as much in standards development as we would hope. There's a few reasons for this. You know, we talk about the fact that standards tend to be in very technical fields and women are less represented in those fields. However, there are also additional barriers. It turns out that research shows that women are less likely to volunteer in professional settings. They're also less likely to be supported by their employer to volunteer in those settings. And so there are some barriers and challenges to getting women to engage in standards development that need to be addressed. The second thing it talks about is that the needs of women are not explicitly addressed in the standards development process. And so what this means is that standards, and Dorothy spoke about this as well, is they are not always addressing women as well as they address men. We've done some work at SEC to see what the relationship is between our standards and the SDGs. And if we look at SDG 5, what we find is that out of approximately 2,500 national standards of Canada, less than 2% of them are having a direct link to SDG 5 for gender equality. And so what that means is that standards are not having the impact that we would hope that they would have. Now, there are reasons for this, and it turns out that standards, like in other fields, tend to see men as being default. And so when we try to think about what's representative as we design products and processes, we often, even inadvertently design them with men in mind, thinking that women tend to be seen as more niche. And so unfortunately, even though women are half the population, they are not considered as representative of humanity. And so they are not always as considered in the design of products and processes. So we know that there is this gap. We also know that there is still a huge lack of awareness on this topic. And so ISO and IEC did a survey of their technical committee experts, and they asked their chairs whether or not they'd considered gender in the work of their committee. And it turns out that 75% of respondents said that no, they were not considering gender in the work that they were doing. And more importantly, they said that they didn't really feel that they needed too many of them. And so you can see these quotes, safety issues do not distinguish between men and women. Hence, when writing our requirements, we do not need to distinguish whether a man or woman shall be protected. Or we are working on technical products issues. Our products are neither male nor female nor diverse. Unfortunately, this is not the case. And so we've seen with the COVID equipment. And so personal protective equipment, those standards were often designed with men in mind. And so there's been evidence that women, especially women in healthcare, are more likely to get COVID because their personal protective equipment is not as protective for them as it is for men. There's work being done by Working Party 29, and they're looking at crash test dummies and the fact that crash test dummies are based on male anthropometry and the greater risk that this puts women at when they are in a car accident. We've also done work at SEC to look at this a bit more broadly. And so we had a study that came out a couple of years ago to look at kind of the consequences of not considering gender in standards development. The idea behind this research was that standards can protect health and safety. And if that's the case, then we would expect to see that countries that are more involved in standardization would see a reduction in the number of people who die as a result of unintentional injuries. And indeed, that's the case. However, when you look more closely at the data, what you find is that the effect is entirely driven by men. And so even after controlling for variables that might confound those results, what we see is that the more countries involved in standardization, the less men that they have dying as a result of unintentional injuries. When you look at the effect for women, there is no relationship. And so what that tells us is that standards are not protecting women as well as they protect men. So the declaration, as I said, I think has done an excellent job in drawing attention to this issue. There's research to demonstrate the impact of this issue. And now increasingly there's efforts focused on what can we do to address this. And so as part of the GRSI, I've been leading a project team to develop guidelines on how to develop gender responsive standards. So I've listed kind of the purpose and the audience for those guidelines. What I really want you to realize is that the intent for these guidelines is to ensure that people have the tools that they need to develop standards that will be gender responsive. When we thought about these guidelines, we thought it was really important that they were directed to anyone who's involved in the standards development process. This is not meant to be just for leaders of standard development organizations or chairs of committees. We provided practical, actionable steps that anyone who's involved in standards development can use, with the idea being that broader engagement is going to be more effective to help bring about change. In terms of the content of these guidelines, we focus on two areas. The first, obviously, is on increasing representation. So representation is really important to ensure that standards are gender responsive. There is evidence that when there's greater involvement of women, products are more gender responsive. As part of that, though, we need to make sure that when we bring more women to the table, that we actually listen to them. And so the guidelines also provide recommendations on how to ensure that meetings are inclusive and that everyone is able to effectively contribute. The second thing we focus on is the importance of making sure that the standards are gender responsive regardless of who is participating. So we know that it's going to take a little bit of time to get representation to where it should be. We also want to ensure that the onus is not on the women at the table to make sure that the standards are gender responsive, but that there are processes in place and guidance that they can follow to ensure that when standards are being developed, regardless of who's participating, they are gender responsive. One of the things that entails is even just specifying what has been done to consider gender and making sure that that is articulated in the standard. An example I like to share around this is a standard that is out there for handheld tools. Now, these standards for handheld tools will often mention that you need to have a firm grip to avoid kickback. They don't specify what a firm grip means. And so if you look at grip strength, it varies significantly by both gender and age. And so when they specify a firm grip, it is unclear whether that my grip is going to be sufficiently firm to avoid kickback, or is it referring to something else? And so even just articulating that within the standard can enable people to have confidence and to understand that these things were considered in their development. Now, in terms of next steps, the guidelines and advanced copy has been posted on the UNECE website. They are open for comment. And so I would encourage you to take a look. And if you have thoughts on the guidelines, then please share those. The deadline for submitting any comments is May 31st. At that time, we will be incorporating that feedback and revising them as needed. The guidelines will then go to the annual meeting for final approval, at which time they will be published in both English, French, and Russian. Ideally, we'll be able to translate them to additional languages. The gender declaration was published in additional languages as well, and we think that will help with the uptake. Thank you very much for the time. I'm very happy to respond to any questions as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Barkuda, for an informative presentation. Much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our last speaker, who will talk about the importance of education in standardization, Dr. Zaneta Lakova. Mrs. Lakova earned her PhD in economics from the University of Lorraine in France. She works as an assistant professor at the Faculty of Economics of Mattei Bell University and teaches economic theory. Her areas of research include macroeconomic challenges with special emphasis on digital transformation and European economic integration issues. She is a member of the team of teachers delivering the study program Finance, Banking and Investment under the guarantee of Professor Marta Orviska. We look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will try to share my screen. Thank you. It's a really privilege for me to present at this forum the ideas that our recognized expert, Professor Marta Orviska, has prepared to deliver. Unfortunately, due to her current health discomfort, she can't address this message to the audience personally. The presentation The presentation will highlight the importance of education about standardization for sustainable development. In this context, the UNECE initiative on education about standardization and started group activities will be presented with its real output. A new course on standardization at Matej Bell University in Slovakia, and challenges for future activities in the field of education about standardization, fostering the contribution to SDGs achievement. This slide shows the complexity of the topic by the example of the ICO standards helping to meet all 70 SDGs. The number of standards is consistently increasing. This desirable trend represents a challenge for education, which is supposed to be multidisciplinary and focused on transferable skills. Standards work for people, for planet, and for prosperity. The importance of education on standards as the base of understanding and progress is supported by the main idea of the 70s SDG, partnership for the goals. The different partnership frameworks are captured by academics. This slide is highlighting a specific conceptual scheme that could serve as an expertise co-creation and knowledge-sharing model. Today, we are facing the shift from triple to quadruple helix innovation ecosystem model. The fourth helix in innovation achievement, civil society, for example, the NGOs active in ecological issues, can play the crucial role of activator for the identification and dissemination of solutions towards SDGs. As in the previous triple helix model, the role of academia remains important in enhancing the partnership between multiple actors. The next slide is describing the efforts of bringing standardization to university curricula. We, as the representatives of academia, consider important the activities within the UNECE initiative OWP6 and subgroup started. Recommendation I on education on standards-related issues, which recommends governments to include standards in educational curricula for not only engineers, but also economists, lawyers, managers, etc. UNECE model program with 15 modules is proposed at the disposal of the professors. Last but not the least, the teaching materials are provided to help academia. We need to stress that other initiators are also playing an important role, both at the supranational and national levels. For example, in February this year, the European Commission is presenting a new standardization strategy, proposing actions which will enable the next generation of standardization experts. In Europe, standards education is organized by individual universities, which are playing the roles of entities providing teaching and research activities, as well as activities concerning cooperation with different bodies. At the Matej Bell University, for example, various courses related to standards and quality management are provided, and in the next slide we will focus on the new course, Standardization and International Standards, prepared for the students of the study program Finance, Banking and Investment. This specific course was developed on the basis of the UNECE model program, which served as an impulse. The content of this course is close to the UNECE model program. It consists of 13 areas, with 2 of them different from UNECE suggestions. The course was opened in 2016 and is a compulsory elective course for master's degree students in finance, banking, and investment. In total, 178 students follow this course. The proportions of study program students opting for the new course varies between 40 and 50% yearly. According to our experience, the optimal size of students group is around 20, allowing us to anchor the theoretical and conceptual frameworks in the lectures, but also to apply case studies and other challenge-based learning methods. The reactions of students are positive, and some of them choose the standards-related issues for their diploma thesis as well. Our alumni are confirming that education on standards-related issues is beneficial. The next slide presents some challenges for standardization in higher education institutions. The study materials are available for students at our faculty in the local LMS Moodle platform. During the pandemic times, of course, distance learning platforms were rapidly developed. The course standardization and international standards continues to be provided by the Faculty of Economics to its students, as well as to the students of other faculties.
Mrs. Lakova, I would like to ask you to wrap up in 2 minutes if possible. So we have time for some questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so besides these teaching activities, of course, there is a lot of activities which concern research, and our experience is showing that to achieve a very good outputs, we need to cooperate with different stakeholders. To conclude, the question is, how can we adapt the teaching to life? Since 2012, the started teams provide information and methodological support to standardization teachers. Under the pressure of the urgency of the current challenge, besides the existing modules updating efforts, a new model on global sustainability challenges should be added to WP6 model program. It is important to make students aware of the latest developments in the standardization institutions agenda, like, for example, ICO, adaptation to climate change, or sustainable finance or circular economy. To conclude, standards education is different to many other university courses in the extent to which it can profitably draw on the knowledge and the experience of the practitioner outside of academia. They need to be engaged in the teaching of the course. With the increased sophisticated of IT, online courses are becoming increasingly effective. It is possible that standards professionals and others who are engaged in some way with standards could do such courses via distance learning. These are just some possibilities. There are many things to be left out. The issue is important, and the discussion on the way forward is badly needed. We are here to open the agenda for the discussion on various ways forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lakova, and sorry for interrupting in a topic that's extremely important in the field of standards and regulatory cooperation. But we can share, of course, your presentation, and we rely on your continued activity in the Working Party and UNECE also. So thank you so much. Again, on the behalf of UNECE and the Working Party 6, I would of course like to thank a lot to the delegations of Mexico, Switzerland, UK, Germany, Canada, and Slovakia for the contribution, as well the UNECE Secretariat and the Bureau team for also being active organizing this event. We have a few minutes left. It's always very stressful with these webinars, and I will soon like to open the floor for any questions from the audience. I have myself also a question, and that's for any of the speakers who would like to address it. As I see it, our regulatory environments gets more and more complicated due to digitalization, new technologies, and also different new policy goals that we have to take into account in the regulatory environment. Also, what concerns sustainability, the possibilities to implement sustainability goals may vary to a high degree depending on different countries, what kind of form you can do it, and it's also challenges for countries in development. So my question is really, how well can our regulatory communities coordinate themselves, in your opinion, as there are many organizations involved, and whether does our speakers see any conflicts of interest when it comes to actually implement sustainability standards? I let to any of you who feel tempted to answer this question, and then we will take some questions from the floor if possible. Thank you. Is there anybody who would like to comment on the ability for the regulatory community coordinate themselves? Do we have good possibilities for this?
I can just make a very quick comment. I think there is the possibility, yes, but again, I will go back to the 6 principles. There's a possibility of collaborating, and there's a possibility of being all in the same direction, but it does depend on following the key rules. And I will briefly just answer one of the questions that's already in the chat. That the TBT agreement does provide the flexibility and leaves the choices of members while strongly encouraging harmonization. So this ties up a bit with that there is the possibility to harmonize. There is no single standards. It's a way of collaborating. So I think in our case, we do hope that all the organizations are able to just do that, to collaborate, so they can make our job easier in WTO.
Thank you so much. And I would also like to give the floor to Aizol. You had maybe a comment?
Yes, thank you. It's pretty much in line with Ms. Almeida's comment. I think the 6 principles give an important guide on developing international standards. I think for regulators to use international standards in support of the public policies is a very good way of coordinating and collaborating, because those international standards developed through those principles have been done through collaboration, through stakeholder engagement, and based on those principles. So that facilitates the task of those needing to comply to those regulations. I think we have talked about COVID and how cooperation helped, and international standards. Some of them were made available freely, and this was a result of collaboration, actually, as well as an example. And I think what happens in the European Union and the support that standardization gives to regulation is also another nice example.
Thank you so much for the comment. I would also like to address the UNECE Secretariat. Can we go over for a few minutes, do you think, or do we have to shut down? Maybe I get a comment from the...
No, that's we're running this on our own WebEx. So if the speakers are willing to stay on for maybe 5 more minutes or 10 more minutes, we can go over time without a problem.
Super. We have at least one question from the audience, which I will just read it here, which sounds whether the World Trade Organization believe that the TBT agreement is sufficient to overcome competing interests that currently exist in standards development by different organizations, or is there a need to accept standard development by just few organizations, such as some of the standards developing organizations? Maybe this is very much for the WTO to answer.
Well, yeah, quickly, as I mentioned, the committee has promoted more coherence. So the agreement does leave a choice to the members but it encourages harmonizations, encourages the uses of standard. Again, it's flexibility, and the flexibility that the TBT agreement gives compounded with the 6 principles is what allows to really know what is a relevant standard, and that should not only be once, it could be depending on how you do how do you implement, is that you can arrive that it's not only one organization, but it's what is relevant for the members, taking into account, again, the principles that are enshrined in our decision.
Thank you so much. Do we have more questions from the audience? Let's see. I cannot see. Maybe I could address actually the education on standardization. I believe that it was maybe mentioned in your presentation, but maybe you could clarify. I mean, education on standardization does not only concern engineering students who will use such standards for product conception, but is it also pertinent for students in most disciplines that touch international trade, And I would like to ask the experience on this. How well is standards education integrated into international trade programs? I think that could be interesting for all of us.
Yeah, okay, thank you for the question. To answer it, I would like to share the experience we have at our faculty. It's a faculty of economics. So the course about standardization is proposed to students of finance, banking, and investment. So these are not technicians, but rather the economists and future financial experts, which will deal with questions like accounting standards or other type of standards as well. And we are trying in the course to explain them how the standardization globally and generally is helping to bring some positive effects. So they will be much more willing to address these standards and to apply them in the context. So our experience is rather positive.
Thank you so much. And a final question, maybe I can address Mrs. Saville, and maybe you could give more examples how UK is making use of a gender responsive standards initiative. That might be that last question.
Sure, very happy to. I mean, to start with, I'll say that our national standards body, the British Standards Institution, have been very involved in this. BSI's Stephanie Anon was one of the lead authors and chairs the initiative. BSI's approach is really, it's known as inclusive as standard. So it's very much aligned to the principles of the Gender Responsive Standards Initiative, sort of promoting more diverse participation, a more inclusive environment that helps overcome some of those barriers that women face when participating in the development of standards, and also systematically ensuring that standards themselves are inclusive. As a government, we want to connect with that and to support that as best we can. And one of the ways in which we're doing that is in recognising the opportunity that gender responsive standards can play in supporting women's access to the benefits and opportunities of trade. So we're committed to creating a global trade policy which promotes gender equality and women's economic empowerment worldwide. And for example, our new free trade agreements with Japan, Australia and New Zealand contain standalone trade and gender equality chapters, which provide a basis for further cooperation on this issue. So, I mean, that's just one of kind of many available examples of how the Gender Responsive Standards Initiative is a really useful reference for governments. I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, it's my terrible task to keep the time. It's irritating to stop discussions when we have so much competence and expertise in our webinar room. But we will certainly have more possibilities to meet and share experiences. I hope also that the delegates and participants can see who is speaking of what topic, and maybe can contact also the speakers for more questions or information. And of course, join the Working Party 6 meetings to get more information of all these topics. So I sincerely thank all the speakers and everybody involved today, and all the participants who have been with us today. It has been truly a rewarding and informative session. So I close by this meeting, and my sincere thanks to everybody.